time, again, when parents are normally busy, making sure that their children obtain the necessary supplies, materials, and clothing that they need in order to be successful. COVID-19 has changed all of that. And we are now living in a period of great uncertainty. As a direct result of that, school district officials and school board members are having to make one of the toughest decisions of their entire career. And I have to tell you that serving in the capacity of superintendent of schools, I don't know if parents or community members will ever know how hard it is to make a decision whether or not to close schools on a snow day. And in most instances, school district superintendents only stayed up for one night to make that decision. And so I hadn't planned to do this, but I would like to ask that we pray for school district superintendents, their deputies, and cabinet level members, because I want to tell you that to just imagine one night of staying up to make a decision about a snow day for school district leaders, it's been since March. And some school district leaders still have not made the call because they want to make sure that the call that they make is the right decision. So, again, before we go too deep, I did want to acknowledge for on behalf of all district leaders that regardless of what decision that is made, trust me, it's not been an easy one. With that being said, school district officials are following a decision around one of three different models, and most of us already know what they are, particularly as it relates to the reopening of school. One of the models is face-to-face. The school district officials, with the support of the community, intend or make a decision rather to go with the face-to-face models. Then school-age students would actually report in person 5 days a week following social distancing guidelines. Another model that they have a decision to make is whether or not they would follow what is referred to as the hybrid model, meaning that students would spend a few days in school and a few days out of school in a remote learning setting, following an alternative schedule for doing so. And then there's what I call the full-blown remote model, which is the third model that school district officials and school board members have to consider as they work to determine what learning environment they believe is best for their students. One of the things that research is showing us that regardless of large district or small district, sometimes even in the same town, school district officials right next door to one another are making different decisions about what model to follow. So again, I think that it speaks to the level of difficulty that comes with making decisions of this nature. With that being said, I'd like to share that the purpose of this panel discussion is to give our listening audience critical information that you will want to take into consideration so as to elevate your decision-making capacity. We will identify potential issues as is deemed necessary, but each of our esteemed panel members are also prepared to provide for you solid recommendations that should be taken into consideration. And speaking of esteemed panelists, I would like to provide for you an introduction to each of them, if I may. We have Miss Carolyn Franklin. Miss Carolyn Franklin is a social worker administrator from Chicago Public Schools. Miss Carolyn, can you say hi?
Hello, everyone, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you so much. In addition to that, we have Mrs. Felicia Sanders, and Mrs. Sanders is the Deputy Chief of Elementary Schools from Chicago Public Schools. Ms. Sanders?
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and as we represent our CEO, Dr. Janice Jackson, and our Chief Education Officer, Chief Latanya McDade, I'm happy to be here tonight and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so very much for doing so. And now on to a man, at least in the Chicagoland area, that needs absolutely no introduction at all. I'd like to introduce to you the former school board president for the Chicago Board of Education, Mr. Rufus Williams. Mr. Williams.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. Thank you, Reverend Wilson, and I'm happy to be here with you.
Thank you very much. And then we have Dr. Deborah Furr Holden. Dr. Holden is an epidemiologist and Dean of the and Dean of Public Health Integration at Michigan State University, as well as co-chair of the Rainbow Push Health Committee. Dr. Furr Holden.
Good evening. I'm looking forward.
Thank you. We also are joined by the esteemed attorney, Robert Patillo. He's attorney and executive director of Peachtree Project.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. We are also joined by two esteemed parents of the Chicago Public School District. We have Mr. Rutherford and Miss Tracy Simmons. Can you say hi?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for being here, as well as Dr. Leon McDougall. Dr. McDougall, he's a family medicine physician and president-elect, it's my understanding, with the swearing in coming on August 3rd. Congratulations, of the National Medical Association, also referred to as NMA. NMA is the oldest global organization of minority physicians, representing the collective voice of over 45,000 Black physicians. He is also the chair of the Health Committee of the Rainbow Push Coalition. Again, please join me, as well as welcoming our two judges. We have Judge Stacy Bontenheimer, administrative judge, as well as Judge Ann Brecko. Thank you all again for being here tonight. I'd like to start out by asking, I know that, again, you have many different backgrounds and areas of expertise. And so I would like to pose a general question for a few of you to respond to. And that question is, can you please share with us why this topic is of particular interest to you?
So are we just jumping in, Dr. Whitaker? Or are you calling
Yes,
on?
please, Mr. Williams.
Okay. Then I'll start. And first of all, thank you all for having this. This is a very important and timely conversation. In context, I know on a deeply personal level how education provides the opportunity to improve one's lot in life. After high school, I didn't have the money for college. A scholarship from the Better Boys Foundation, an organization that I ran until recently, helped give me the opportunity for a life that has been significantly and demonstrably different. That scholarship from BBF took me on a path to ensure that my children were well educated and imposed upon me the responsibility to ensure the same for others. So I've engaged by volunteering, being on boards of schools, and being the president of the nation's third largest school system. I care about this topic because that's who I am. This pandemic forces us to be more thoughtful. Doing the wrong thing causes people to die. To date, deaths in America from COVID-19 exceed 147,000 people. The deaths and afflictions from this virus have been most impactful in the Black and brown communities, and it didn't have to be this way. We cannot trust what comes from the federal government under Donald Trump. We cannot count on their direction to protect our people. We must do that. This federal administration has not demonstrated that it cares about us. They don't care about Black people. They don't care about poor people. They don't care about children. Too often, for too many politicians, children who don't vote are no more than pawns in the game. The push to open the economy has been Trump's singular goal, no matter how many die, no matter how many get sick. Reopening of the schools is seen as a symbolic and practical sense that we have recovered from this pandemic. Nothing can be further from the truth. In Illinois, Governor Pritzker unequivocally closed schools on March 17th. What has happened? What do we know that says we should reopen them? Is there a cure, a vaccine? Are students no longer potential carriers of this virus? Can they no longer affect parents, grandparents, or others? Do we have PPE for everyone in quantities enough until we have a cure? Are our buildings ready for this? Can we circulate fresh air often enough? Do we have space for adequate social distancing? Can a child wear a mask all day? Can they stay away from one another? Can they stay away from teachers? What happens when the teacher contracts the virus? What happens when we have an outbreak in a school? There are too many unknowns. My work with the schools and my recent work in the community at BBF and beyond causes me to think about this issue as it relates to our children and their families. I have thought about how we reopen our center, considering all of these questions. These experiences give me a perspective that is informed and unique. I am happy to have been called upon, and I feel duty bound to share my experience and my thoughts.
Thank you. Dr. McDougall, can you please share with us why this topic is of particular interest to you? And then I will, again, direct some very specific questions to each of you.
Thank you. A very good question. It should be of particular interest to everyone because this is an issue that affects our entire community. And I'm so happy that Reverend Jackson, Reverend Wilson, Reverend Yeary, and everyone convened this meeting this evening to have this discussion because there is confusion in the land. And when Dr. Williams spoke to how we can't trust what's being said by the executive branch of this government, going back to the origins of COVID-19 emerging as a global threat and a threat to the US going back to January. So now this is really coming home to our children, our future. So this is a very important conversation to have. And when you started the conversation in setting the framework and the three options for schooling and returning to school, I was somewhat surprised this morning when I read our newspaper. So here again, resources will make a difference. So our private schools here in Central Ohio, they plan on going to school 5 days a week in person. They had the resources. They converted the theater. It's in the newspaper. Look on the front page. It's beautiful. I mean, so this population of the students is such where they can expand and use space to convert to that every 6 feet apart. They've hired extra personnel to be able to help with the sanitation and cleaning. They have the PPE because of resources. So in one sense, we're talking about how this is an issue speaking to safety and so on. It's also a resource question. And what has our federal government done to support state and local authorities having the appropriate equipment, staffing, funding to be able to convert? I wish I could show that picture. It's on the front page of the newspaper. It is beautiful. It's laid out. Everybody, the desk and everything. It's so resources will also be critical in however a school system proceeds, and if and the class sizes. They're actually in the newspaper, and I'll shut up after this. It's almost like they're bragging in the newspaper. Our class sizes are smaller. We have the resources. We've just converted our theater into a classroom, separated 6 feet apart. It's beautiful. So something else to consider. I like to cause trouble on these types of calls, but I'm just so that's part of it too. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so very much, Dr. McDougall. I think we would be remiss before I move forward if we didn't hear from one of our parents. Why is this topic of interest to you? Simmons family?
Good evening. So my name is Tracy Simmons, and my husband, Rutherford Simmons, is on the line also. He's a dentist. He's in Champaign, Illinois right now, so we're separated, but I'm glad that you guys considered us. And I'll first drop the bomb and say that we are parents of private school students. Our boys, we have two who just completed 7th grade at Southwest Chicago Christian School in Oak Lawn. But it's the same concerns. I'm on the CPS list. And so I looked at the CPS model, the video that they sent out. And then I look at the model that comes from the superintendent where they're in school. And I'll just say that, first of all, we have, one of our sons has bronchitis. So he's healthy for the most part, but if anything ever activates that bronchitis, it's a problem. And so he is, I wouldn't necessarily say super high risk, but he's close to that category. We don't know what this virus would do, if it were introduced to his system. And so quite naturally, that's a concern for us. And ironically, he is a very, 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 very social child. He's a people lover. He's all over the place. He socializes with the entire school building, from the preschoolers to the administrators. That's just who he is. His peers, he's intelligent enough to know what's going on, but then something else is they're headed to 8th grade, and our plan is to shift them over to CPS for high school. Well, selective enrollment high schools look at 7th grade grades, 7th grade MAP test scores. CPS does not know what it's going to do. They don't know what MAP test scores they're going to consider. They don't know how they're going to figure in the 7th grade grade since that year wasn't completed. So, there's a part of me, and I'll wrap up and maybe let my husband take over. There's a part of me that wants to be selfish and say, I want my kid to go back so he can, get back on these grades and take this MAP test and selective enrollment, but I don't want my selfishness to turn into stupidity and have a sick child or something even worse. And so that's why it's good to listen to people like you guys and just to dialogue.
Thank you so very much for that. For those of you who follow Maslow's theory of hierarchy, Maslow suggests, if you follow the pyramid, that the lowest level, the basic level of need, before we can even progress to meeting the needs of ourselves or meeting the needs of our students, we must start at a basic level. And so at that base level, using his line of thinking, is the need for our students to have food, shelter, water, and safety. And so I'd like to pivot just a bit with regards to safety before we get into what might a return to school look like, and ask from each of your perspectives, what do you think parents should be concerning themselves in the event that their child has to return to school or is asked to return to school to a district that is following a remote or hybrid model?
Good evening, Dr. Whitaker. First of all, I'd just like to say I am certainly an administrator and educator with the Chicago Public Schools for now going into my 30th year, but I'm also a CPS parent. So I have both lenses. And even in a conversation today with my husband and some other CPS parents, we were just talking about the safety, because as a parent, you certainly want your child to be safe. As I consider the work of our district and the various departments that are working feverishly in preparing to open schools, safety is our #1 priority in the Chicago Public Schools. Our CEO, Dr. Jackson, has stated, while we are planning and we're being very thoughtful and we're engaging our stakeholders and community partners, and in fact, this week we have a number of community meetings that we're asking people to join and weigh in and share your thoughts with us. We've surveyed our students, our staffs, and our families. And so we're taking into consideration the thoughts of everyone. What our CEO, Dr. Jackson, has stated repeatedly is that safety is our #1 priority. And even as we consider returning to school, this is the time of year, someone said earlier, where we're getting ready to go back always. But even as we consider that, safety is the #1 priority. And we at the Chicago Public Schools are looking to our health providers for information and for the guidance, and that will determine ultimately what we will do. But in the event, and so as at this point, we have proposed a hybrid model that we're now collecting feedback on. But in that model, safety is key. Safety is our #1 priority. We have spent money, a ton of money already to ensure that we will have the necessary PPE equipment for those who need it, and making sure that we've had hand sanitizing stations and all of the things that are recommended by our health professionals. So we are really, really concerned about safety as parents and as educators, and we're going to do our very best, and no matter which way we end up going, to make sure that we are adhering to all safety and health guidelines for all of our students and our staff.
Thank you. Who else would like to go ahead?
And just to chime in from a legal perspective, I think there are questions the parents are going to have to ask of their districts as they, if they are indeed ordered to go back to school, because as we've seen, it is a jurisdiction by jurisdiction decision. Where I'm located at in Atlanta, at Fulton County, DeKalb County, Clayton County have all announced they're going to be beginning the year with distance learning. Meanwhile, Gwinnett County is having protests of parents demanding that they have in-person learning for the fall. This has turned into a partisan political issue, which it really should not be. But we have to, we're going to have a set of court challenges that go through to determine things such as liability. If a student does become infected with the virus at school, will that liability fall on the school district? Will it fall on the parent through a waiver? Will it be, will their treatment, their hospital bills, if they have to be hospitalized or put on a ventilator, who will bear those insurance costs? If they are indeed deceased, is that negligence on the part of the school that that has to be determined, and what will be the value of that or the price of that? Clearly, we all know that if let's say a student dies from from black mold or black fungus at school, then the school will be liable for that. Would the coronavirus be similar to that, or would it be more similar to a playground accident where parents can sign a waiver and not and absolve the school of that liability? That's yet to be determined by the courts. On the other hand, there are proposals currently going through Congress that would take funding away from school districts and have it follow the child, as opposed to following follow on to the school. And if a student is given distance learning as opposed to in-person learning, would the family need to be compensated to get them additional tutoring in order to do so? So there's an entire suite and set of legal issues that are going to flow out of this and come out of this. And I don't think that school districts are fully prepared. So that is a conversation that parents need to have before deciding on in-person education or distance education, exactly what those legal ramifications will be of returning to school.
Attorney Patillo, I really appreciate you talking about the legal ramifications, because something has come across my desk actually over just the last 24 hours, and that is school district superintendents are running into a situation right now with their insurance companies. You know, serving in a leadership capacity, in addition to the Board of Education, there are certain legal protections, for the lack of a better term, that you have while working in that capacity and leading in that capacity. What hasn't been discussed publicly nationwide is the fact that the insurance companies that insure our school districts are now grappling with
Mhm.
whether or not they will insure school districts. And so that's like something we've never ever experienced and heard of before. And I think is a beautiful lead into where we should head next, which is again going deeper into the conversation about what should not only parents take into consideration as the conversation centers around what model we should follow or whether or not students should actually report to school. But the other thing that I'm finding is, as you all will know, nationwide, the conversation has shifted to having us consider positivity rates associated with the spread of COVID-19 in our respective communities. And so I actually want to direct this question in particular to Dr. McDougall and Dr. Deborah Verholden and anybody else that wants to weigh in on it, because I've not seen this question that I have ready to pose for you posed at a national or an international level. And the specific question is this. First of all, is it not important to consider positivity rates for a village or a city or a town? And the reason why I share that is because, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, when the positivity rates are shared on national television, we receive information relevant to the positivity rate at the national level. In the state of Illinois, we receive, probably like all other states, we receive information relevant to the positivity rates at the state level. And then most recently, that information became available to us at the county level. Where the school, however, the school districts where the majority of the vulnerable students live have different issues relevant to this topic. So my direct question is it not beneficial to have information specific to the positivity rate associated with the spread of COVID-19 at the city level so that we can move closer to getting information about the parents and the community members where our students actually report home to? Because we know that research tells us that children are least likely to get the COVID-19 virus. However, as we all know, they could be carrying they could be what is referred to as asymptomatic and could go home and spread to their parents or grandparents. So again, the direct question is there not a benefit to obtaining positivity rates all the way down at the level for which I have described?
I'll jump in, and then I'll trust my colleague, Dr. McDougall, to jump in behind me. I've had to move locations to keep my Wi-Fi. So if you can't hear me, just give me the cut.
Okay.
So there's a couple issues with this positivity rate, right? The analogy is wherever we look, that's where we find cases. So we're only going to find cases among those that we're testing. So if we're not doing systematic and community-wide testing of children, we really have no real idea of what the positivity rate is in children. So that's the first thing. So what is predictable is when schools reopen and students re-engage, and then some kind of systematic testing is put in place for children, we're going to see an increase in cases among children. That increase is going to be related to an increase in testing among children. So the first thing is, if we're going to send children back to school, we need to figure out how to get children tested before they go back to school so we can understand where they are right now and then see whether or not reopening was related to an increase in the numbers. If we don't do that, then we won't know. And there'll be all of these artifacts that'll be hard to tease out. So that's the first thing. The second thing is children have been in quarantine, probably even more so in social and physical isolation, even more so than adults. And they have really young, vibrant, immune systems. I sort of used to joke, my kids grew up in Baltimore City, and I said that was their natural immunization program because, I remember the first time somebody dropped a lollipop on the ground at the playground and picked it up and put it right back in their mouth. For the kid number one, I went ballistic. Kid number two, I was like, you'll be all right. We start brushing things off and all of that. So kids are much more resilient and more likely to not have some of the really negative outcomes that we see. The death rate in children is very, very low. The hospitalization rate is very, very low. My concern is, what about all of the adults that they're going to come in contact with? Kids are not being educated in a vacuum. If it was a peer teaching program and kids were teaching kids, it would be a very different conversation. But kids potentially become super spreaders because they're going to end up going back to school. They're going to come back home. They're going to come back to their communities. There's just so much that we could put in place. And I think the example that Dr. McDougall gave earlier of what private education affords you is the kind of strategies that we need in place in all school systems. See, unfortunately, we live in an environment and in a culture where high quality education and access to those resources has become a privilege and not a right. So I'm an epidemiologist. I deal with the data, I deal with the numbers, I deal with the testing and the deaths and all of that. I'm not dealing with all of the, intricacies and the really important issues that we have to grapple with around reopening. But as a health equity researcher, I think Dr. McDougall's example highlights it perfectly. This is going to become an issue of power and privilege. And I just fundamentally believe that we should not live in a society where access to a quality education and the assurance of optimal health is something that people experience as a privilege and not a right. And unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. So a lot more provisions, in my opinion, are needed in order for us to reopen safely and make sure that we are protecting all of our children, not just the ones who come from wealth or some geographic or privileged background.
I would like to just chime in real quick. I'm a dentist and we deal with infectious diseases all the time, every day. And each one of our patients gets treated as if they're carriers of AIDS. And that's the way most dentists will treat their patients. And since COVID has started, we've been doing a lot of additional things. We've been fogging rooms and everything gets disinfected after every patient. And we're running out of PPEs. We were asked to save some for the hospitals, and we've had issues in the supply chain of getting some of these things. So when I hear things like the positivity rate of children or the of children aren't passing on this disease, like Dr. Verholden said, they've been in quarantine since March. And in order for someone to give these reports and give these numbers and give these percentages, you have to have a study of the children. And not that I necessarily disbelieve a lot of stuff I see on the news, but who was testing these children? Where did we get this figure from, or this statement that children don't pass on this disease or this virus that's killing hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and that somehow they're immune? What test was given that said, we're going to put these children in this room with people with COVID and see if they pass it on? That didn't exist. That didn't happen. So I'm not sure how we know truthfully versus anecdotally that children don't pass on this disease. And that's one of the things that I'm concerned about. I see results. I hear statements. I don't see any research. I just hear somebody on TV saying, children don't pass on the disease. Well, what was the study? What was the information? Where was the double-blind study that gave us the facts that children don't catch or pass on this disease with any sort of level? If our positivity rate is 1%, if 1,000 kids go to a school field exam or field trip, and 1%, we were told, hey, 1% of your children will catch the disease and 0.01% will die of this group. Do you send your child to that field trip? And that's my concern about the schools. How do we know any of this is true? How do we know any of this is functional and will work with our children? How do we know that each individual school has enough PPE, enough disinfectant, enough sprays, enough wipes? If anybody has an idea of where to get Clorox wipes, please let me know, because we've been trying to find them for months.
But this is the problem I see with this notion of parents signing liability waivers. And I know Attorney Patillo can chime in on this. If you're entering into a contract, which is basically what a liability waiver is, it's saying, we'll educate your child, and in exchange for that, you will hold us blameless if something goes bad. How can you enter into that contract when there's no authentic meeting of the minds? If you don't fully grasp and understand and appreciate the risk of your child going back to school and re-engaging, how can you in good faith and in good confidence sign a contract waiving liability to a school or a school district if you've not had a meeting of the minds? We can't have a meeting of the minds if we don't have the facts.
And you're completely correct, and that's one of the points that that I think we have that has to be litigated and pushed through the court system. Because right now, what we saw in Major League Baseball was they thought that they could get started back up. You know, they pushed it off. They did every study. They didn't make it through one weekend before an entire baseball team, the Florida Marlins, got wiped out by the virus. I think half the team got infected over the weekend. So if Major League Baseball, for the billions of dollars they have invested in that, can't make it happen, I don't know what the chances are of a school district in Waverly Hall, Georgia, or Marion, Alabama, pushing children back into school will have them succeeding at it. And on the issue of liability waivers and the ability of school districts to waive liability, as Dr. Holden said, you have to have informed consent when you're signing a waiver. Somebody can't just have you sign a blanket waiver absolving them of all damages, of all harm. As the saying goes, you can't waive the right to death. So as to say, so without the full medical information, without some clear scientific guidance, the guidance we're getting out of Washington is imprecise, to say the least. And without that, I don't think any waiver will be able to hold up in court, because we just don't know what will happen going down the lines, and none of this has worked its way through the judicial system.
So, Dr. McDougall, I'm sure you have lots on your mind, but I do want to pose this specific question to you again, and then have you run with it in any direction you'd like. But the very specific question that I have for you is, to what extent might it prove beneficial to move the study of positivity rates all the way down to the community level, as opposed to just the national, state, regional, and county levels?
So that's a very good question. And that's where it should be. And Dr. Fur Holden and I, we've been co-chairing the Rainbow Push Coalition Health Committee, and we've engaged the CDC to obtain data. So when this I'll tell a little funny story here. So when we were first having discussions about this, and we're on a call, maybe with all the visuals that we have here, and I'm looking at the CDC website, and is giving data in regards to COVID-19 rates, but there is no race and ethnicity data on the CDC website. So I actually sent an email to the CDC asking about this, and the doctor says something about, well, we haven't been, it's been a delay in getting information from the state and local health departments, and essentially we'll get back to you. And so, and now I'm gonna connect this to now. So it's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That's their job, to be able to collate this information on a national level. But we have our state and local health departments that should also be collecting this information. And there's been some pushback too, even when this first came out at the local levels, because people were concerned that, well, in my city, if I do this testing and it shows that all these African-American folks are getting this disease, what does it say about our public health system? What does it say about me as a leader? What does it say about our city government? So there was some apprehension, I think, for people to even really want to publicly acknowledge the disparities in infectivity based on, well, what will this really mean? How will this reflect upon our department now that it's a known fact that African American, Blacks, Latinx communities, American Indian communities are suffering from disproportionate infectivity rates, and then morbidity or damage to kidneys. As a matter of fact, I have a a patient now, 35-year-old African-American male, contracted COVID-19, was in the ICU, on ventilator, had pneumonia. Now he's on dialysis. So we don't, but you don't hear about that, at the national level. So I went to this, so I'm gonna bring this back. So that local collection of data and sharing that with the community and working with local health departments, there should be the city school system and the local health department should be working in concert, because as was stated by Dr. Simmons and Dr. Furr-Holden and Attorney Patillo and Dr. Williams and others, we're going to need to follow outcomes. We're going to need to do some surveillance, whatever way we decide to do this. And we're not getting that support at the national level. The national level, folks don't want us to know, because again, it's that, how is this going to make me look? So we have to get beyond that. So that's those are my thoughts, Dr. Whitaker. I
appreciate you sharing that, because when I talked about the agonizing decisions, we all know the communities where the poorest students live. And I want to say poor in terms of their access to financial, in some cases, technological resource, but very, very, very rich in terms of their intellectual potential. It's very important for me to add that piece of my thinking. But with that being said, and we'll move forward, is again, being a school district official, it has been concerning to serve, much like my peers in districts where 95% of the students qualify for free and reduced lunch, and 95% of the students are Black or brown, and administrators are trying to make a decision about what model to follow, particularly considering the variable associated with the health risk, and not be able to obtain information relevant to the positivity rate at the local level, and to not have this be on any national other conversation outside of Rainbow Push, does a great disservice to our students and our communities. And so it is our greatest hope that as a result of this conversation, that as soon as yesterday, that our state health organizations began to make that information readily available, so that we can elevate our decision-making ability, taking that variable into consideration. So let's assume that students are in school following one of the models safely. How important is it to address the digital divide? I'm gonna ask our judges to chime in on this, as well as Mr. Williams, Ms. Franklin, those of you who are our panelists as well. But I ought to start with our judges and ask again this very, very direct question. How important is it to address the digital divide, I'll say not only in our schools, but in our communities?
This is Judge Bottenheimer, and thank you, Reverend Jackson, for allowing us to speak on this issue. And my Chief Administrative Law Judge of the North Carolina Office of Administrative Hearings, Judge Mann. We are particularly interested in the rights of children with special needs, children with disabilities who've been identified, to have access to the appropriate educational services that they're entitled to by federal law in the public school system, which they are not entitled to in private schools, by the way. Private schools have no obligation to serve these particular students. And these are students with disabilities, whether they're physical, mental, behavioral disabilities. It's a huge range. And so they have been entitled to assistive technology as a related services since 1975. So related services have been in their individualized educational programs for decades. And they should be provided with the types of assistive technology they need in order to receive what they are entitled to, which is a free and appropriate public education. Not every student has this legal right. This is a federal mandated right. Schools must provide these services. Your regular education students do not have this right. And in many states, they don't have the right to a sound basic education under their state constitution. And our state, North Carolina, they do have that right. So there's huge dichotomy between what children with special needs have a right to versus children with regular education issues are. But to speak to the children with special needs, they have to have access to Wi-Fi. Their teachers have to have access to Wi-Fi. And I'm talking about reliable Wi-Fi. You're looking at me and you're seeing gaps in my communication because I don't have reliable Wi-Fi at my home. I do have it at the Office of Administrative Hearings, but that's not where I am right now. I'm remote. So they have a right to reliable Wi-Fi. They have a right to assistive technology. And this assistive technology should be in their individualized educational plans, their IEPs. And this is something that school systems must consider, in addition to all the other gamut of issues they must consider as far as related services. And we could spend hours on this issue, but to condense it in one sentence, these children have rights that other students do not have, and school administrators and politicians have to be aware that federal law grant them these rights, and these rights are funded by the federal government. Public school systems do not have to accept these funds. They could decide that we don't want to provide special education services, and we choose not to. We're not going to accept federal funds for this purpose. So this is a federally fundated mandate. And there are also child find issues, which we'll talk about later when we talk about special education issues, but they must have access to these services and to the Wi-Fi and the technology that will give them access to the services. Or what's going to happen is, and school systems are very much afraid of this, that they will be in my courtroom with a lawsuit complaining about the fact that they did not receive a free and appropriate public education as they were entitled to by their individualized education plan. And regardless of the circumstances, that right has not been waived. So that's something that politicians and educators, and it's difficult to serve children with special needs under a normal circumstance. With these unique circumstances, I can't imagine what educators and special education teachers are going through, and administrators. And I fear for the safety of special education teachers also, because now they're dealing with children who may have intellectual disabilities, who may not understand what social distancing means, although they may understand it maybe in their homes, but they're coming into a school environment, and then the children with Down syndrome who are so affectionate and loving and want to touch, they won't understand why they can't do that. So not only the technology, but the safety issues are overwhelming when it comes to special needs children. And this is something that needs to be discussed. It needs to be an issue that politicians and educators are aware of this, but how they deal with it, that's another issue. So technology can only help so far. These children, many of these children must have in-person services. They must be in the school system. They have the right to related services such as speech language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, many therapies of which are difficult, if not impossible, to provide remotely, although there has been evidence that additional curriculum is being developed for that. Thank goodness for that. But it's a completely different situation when you're talking about students with special needs, let alone the children with regular needs. It's a dialogue that needs to happen.
Oh,
Mr. Williams, do you want to weigh on that? What would you identify as some of the minimal level of expectations as to what teachers, administrators, and political officials should do in order to address the digital divide that exists in their community?
Well, Dr. Whitaker, I'll begin by saying, the issue of the digital divide has been longstanding and it's real. And it elevates in these times because what we know is, for one, over the nation, white students are now only about 46% of that population. So the majority of students in public schools in the country are Black students and brown students and Native American. There are a high incidence, certainly in Chicago and many other large school systems, of homelessness. There's a high incidence of low income. There's a high incidence of families that don't have don't have computers, don't have laptops, and certainly do not have the internet. When we look at some of our most challenged communities, the whole issue of couch surfing and moving around and congested conditions is real. And so when we start to think about what it is that we need to do to try to address those things, we have to recognize that this divide makes it that much more uneven in trying to bring forth equality in education to these children. So when we start to look more granularly at the information that's available, we need to understand, and politicians and leaders need to fully understand who has what and what the availability of those things would be. Who has computers? How many children in the household? How many computers are necessary? How much space is there to do the work that needs to be done with? Where are other places that we can find relief for families that don't otherwise have it? Can libraries become available? Can community centers become available? Right now, what we find, honestly, is that there are children who depend on libraries. They depend on fast food restaurants. They depend on coffee shops. They depend on school buses. They depend on all these other places to go and try to find a way in which to connect to the internet in order to get work done. I can tell you at BBF, we often had to send children away at night because they didn't have any way of getting online. So they were hiding in bathrooms to get their work done when we were looking to close the center. So politicians, educators, administrators, we have to understand at a very granular level, at a family level, at a student level, what is it that they have and what is it that they need, and how do we best get that to them?
I was going to kind of piggyback on what Mr. Williams was saying. In Chicago, we are aiming to have one social worker per school. And the social worker's perspective is usually what we consider can you hear me? An ecological perspective, which is looking at the child, the community, the family, and a lot of the issues of the digital divide come very obvious when a parent will say, well, I have 4 kids at home and I have 1 laptop computer. And I know in Chicago public schools, we did have a situation where we were giving computers to students and to families so that they were able to receive the instruction via remote learning. And as a social worker, we have over 1,600 related service providers in schools, occupational therapists, physical therapists, of course, social workers and psychologists. And we were doing teletherapy with our students. We also did, for our students, we had their IEPs were serviced remotely. We would have the parent, even with the use of their cell phone, we would do student observations via their cell phone so that we could see the student and attempt to give a really good or the best evaluation that we could give so that we could determine what necessary supports that child would need. And one more thing I wanted to mention is that regardless of the type of instruction that the child receives when school resumes, you have to know that that child that has been isolated for a very long time, when they come back to school, it won't be, okay, we have all the physical necessities available, all of the spacing. But you also have to remember that that child, the social emotional health of that child is also very important. There may be some paranoia with going around other people. So you have to have mental health in the schools, regardless of the model, to ensure that the students have the supports to deal with school, because this has definitely impacted the child being at home for 6 months. So we have to have mental health services prepared regardless of the model, mental health services for the child, and with using the ecological perspective, the child, the parent, for everyone, to ensure that we give all we can to help everyone adjust to, regardless of the model, adjustment until we can move forward with the total immersion back into the school setting.
And I could just add to what's already been said that, yes, I absolutely agree that COVID-19 has laid bare all of the inequities with regard to the digital divide within our school system, within our society as a whole. And so when you take what Judge Bottenheimer said, I also work in special education, and you combine it with families who are Black, families who are brown, who also have a child within the household who has special needs. So you now have perhaps a household that hasn't had a computer and they haven't had Wi-Fi. And then you also have a child who has these special needs that sometimes the only way they can access their education is through these digital tools. And so we do, and I'm glad that you mentioned mental health services, because compounded with the special needs of these families and these children is the fact that the children simply don't understand. Many of the children don't understand, no matter how great their parents are, and trying to explain, why am I not having the one-on-one aid that I used to have? Even why am I not in that very small classroom that was helping me? Why is that not happening? So it's really a devastation. I have seen, even as of this month, in cases I'm working on where the family was just getting a computer for the first time. And remember, we've been in remote learning for a long time. And I will say I've seen some district personnel try to work very, very hard with the families and try to make up for that deficit. So my last comment is that no matter who the current president is, no matter who the current head of the Department of Education is, they cannot change the law with regard to these special education children. Those funds are there and they should be covering their special needs.
And if you don't mind, I'll make a real quick comment. There are going to be a lot of mental issues and a lot of people who are normal before COVID. And we have this experience here in my offices. They were normal before COVID. They caught it. They went through it. They survived. And the mental issues that they have after post-COVID are significant and they are very, very hard to manage. These people are going through depression. It's almost like they've been in a war. I've had a few patients tell me the disease is like drowning for 3 or 4 straight days. And so those are one of the parents of these children, if they catch it, then the child is going to be in a situation where the parent is not going to be able to handle it. Even if they were normal before COVID, after COVID, they're going to have a lot of significant issues and need a lot of significant help.
If I could chime in on that particular comment that you made, a lot of educators are considered the pandemic as an adverse childhood experience. Quite honestly, that's something that, especially with special needs children, that educators must take in consideration. And they need trauma-informed interventions when these children, not only special ed, but a number of regular ed students when they return to the school system. And the special ed children who have been affected by this will also have comorbid disabilities, potentially, and social emotional needs. So there's a lot of evaluating that needs to be done on the onset as far as special education students who are entitled to it, but also your regular education students who are coming back into the classroom too. With that, I'll take it off.
And if I could just add something, it's not just for the people who get COVID. So the adverse childhood experience you got to get for a lot of our children, just being isolated for this long and being at home and being forced to be in the house when they see other things on the media and other things, is an adverse childhood experience. They've had a complete and total disruption to their normal way of life. And even if your parent or caregiver wasn't personally impacted by COVID, we're now reaching that critical point where almost everybody knows somebody who's had COVID. And a lot of people also know people who've died from COVID. So people are also dealing with the stress and trauma of dealing with the loss of loved ones, dealing with sick loved ones who they were not able to visit in the hospital. They're dealing with job loss. There's also significant adverse life events that families, even if someone in the house is not personally infected with COVID, there's an impact in the whole household and in the community writ large. So it's not a simple issue. I have a question, if I could, for Judge Bottenheimer, and I really appreciate the advocacy for the children with special needs. My concern is we've got these provisions in place for all children, but it's akin to gums without teeth. If we've got these laws on the book that provide certain provisions for all children and children with special needs, but they're not being enforced, what is our remedy? So we have laws in the book that protect children, but they're not enforced.
Well, that's a good question, because I'm only talking about the laws that protect children with special needs. They have federally mandated rights under the Individuals with Disability Education Act. Your regular education students don't necessarily have the same rights that a child with special needs has. And when I talk about a child with special needs, I'm talking about a child with a disability that adversely affects their education. So you're presuming that all children who are in regular education have rights. That may or may not necessarily be the case, but all children with special needs who have been identified or who are suspected of having disabilities, there's a huge child fine issue here that we haven't even gotten to. They have rights under federal law. They have rights to have the appropriate assistive technology, whether it's Wi-Fi, whether it's computers. I mean, they have elevated rights under federal law that regular ed students do not have. So I'm only talking about the rights of children with special needs and not regular ed students. So you're making assumptions that a regular ed child has a right. And as I said before, the North Carolina Constitution, where I am, requires every child receive a sound basic, the opportunity for a sound basic education, whatever that means. That doesn't mean they have the right to a great education or an equitable education. So we have to be careful when we talk about the legal obligations of school systems. And it's like I said before, it's extremely difficult to serve children with special needs. And I feel for the educators, having been an attorney, a private practitioner who represented children with special needs for 25 years, the majority of my practice, and then now as a judge who sees special education cases regularly and monitors them. I have great compassion for the educators who are required to implement this law, which is a federally mandated, unfunded mandated law. And I cannot imagine, and I'm sure Judge Ann Rico is seeing this in her mediations, how these educators and administrators are dealing with it now. So you're making an assumption there about regular ed students, that they have certain rights.
I think there's something that we should really look at as we go forward from this discussion. As a judge has indicated, there's a federal protected right for special ed students with special needs. However, each state determines the quality of education for the students within the state. So there's a state right to public education, and it's defined by each state legislature. There is no federally protected right, except some students are guaranteed funding in our public schools under Title I. And so we have to look at when the president, the executive branch threatens to cut federal funds, it impacts special needs students, and there will be some lawsuits that will protect them, filed to protect them. But we also have to look at these students who are Title I students, many of whom are growing up and living in communities that are under-resourced, underfunded at every possible level. And as Rufus Williams knows, when he was at CPS and still at CPS, our children are now living in environments that are filled with violence. PTSD is real. And so when you talk about social emotional health, there's some issues that have to be addressed when they go back, because they've lost loved ones, they've lost friends, and they've had no contact with friends, they haven't been able to play in the last 5 or 6 months. So these are all factors that we should look at. But this idea that children have no guaranteed right to a high quality public education is the fight of this century.
And I'm sorry, Reverend Wilson. I just wanted to add to that. Yes, even though it was in, this is in direct response to the question I think was asked about, well, how is it enforced? Well, with great difficulty, even though there is federal law about federal funding for special education children, that does not mean that they the funds were utilized locally, including here in Chicago, for special education children. And it was long-term lawsuits that really had to guarantee that special education children would get the rights and the funding they were entitled to already under law. So yes, with great difficulty. And so even now they aren't enforced as they should be.
One other thing, Reverend Wilson, if I may, you're talking about Title I funding and the fact that a lot of Title I funding is being diverted to private schools. Well, Title I funding is not funding that funds special education. It's separate, but Title I funding does fund the regular education and the interventions that are used to determine whether a child should be referred for special education. So if you are taking away the interventions and the research-based interventions that are funded by Title I, which is in regular education, then in a sense, you're taking away the funding for evaluating and determining if a child has special needs. And then that impacts the child-fied obligation of every school system. And unfortunately, if you impact the child-fied obligation of the school system, then you do not provide appropriate funding for that child-fied obligation, then what you are funding is the school to prison pipeline. And that affects the majority of Black and brown students. And we all know what happens once a child is not determined to have reading disabilities or learning disabilities. They get stuck in the school to prison pipeline. So Title I funding does not fund special education, but it's integral and very important for special education funding, special education services, as far as the child-fied obligation that every school system has, but private school systems do not have that obligation. So distinction to make.
We've just entered in a very rich and spirited dialogue. What I want to do is move us into recommendations specific to one of the topics that we've covered in particular, and I would say overwhelming, in addition to meeting the needs of our special needs students, in addition to recognizing some of the traumatic experiences that our students are having as a direct result of being disconnected from their peers. From a recommendation perspective, I'd like to hear from some of the educators, possibly former board president. What are your recommendations for what can be done? Say a school district chooses to follow a remote model for instructing students during this period of COVID-19 and or a hybrid model. So what do you recommend? Essentially, I'm suggesting virtually. What can be done, since we know that we must address the social, emotional, psychological needs of the students that we serve? What can be done virtually to provide support? What are you doing to provide support to those families during this time?
Well, I'll just begin. As it is on our stated on our website, we have proposed a hybrid model at this time, which is for consideration. It has not been finalized.
I'm sorry, sir. I forgot I'm on a panel.
All right. We're asking individuals to weigh in, but in this hybrid model, we would have students who would be, and now let me just deal with the elementary school. So first of all, our proposal is pre-K students would be have in-person learning as it has been for them. So our kindergarten through 8th grade students would have a hybrid model. So they would go 2 days to school. So that we'll have a shift A and a shift B, which is about 15 students or so. They go to school for 2 days, Monday, Tuesday for shift A, for example. On Wednesday, everyone would be home so that they would be able to adequately clean and disinfect schools and classrooms and all spaces in the building. And then Thursday and Friday, the other group of students, Pod B, shift B, would come to school for in-person learning. So this is the proposal that we have. And then our most critical learners, our students in cluster programs, we're recommending in-person learning for them every day because we know that they are our most vulnerable learners. And again, there are a number of nuances to this, but what our thoughts are is that with having students in a limited number of students in what we would call a pod, 15 students being together. It would allow us to be able to have social distancing there. We certainly would be asking students to wear a face covering. They would remain together. So in the event a case of COVID-19 was discovered, it would allow us to have a better handle on the contact tracing for these students. So it would not be school as usual. We would ask this teacher to meet those students outside, bring them in. Principals would have to work out schedules that will allow a group of children to travel down the corridor at a particular time so that they would not be in close proximity to another group of students. And so we've got a whole build out in our proposed remote reopening plan, pardon me. And so again, the hybrid model would allow for 2 days in person for each set. And then on Wednesday, in our current model, current proposal, all students would learn at home with the teacher teaching to give the opportunity for cleaning and sanitizing the schools for that day in between. And there are other nuances there, but I'll just pause there, Dr. Whitaker.
So thank you very much for that, Ms. Sanders. I need to push the educators on the panel toward this question in particular, which is, what do we recommend, or what are we doing, recognizing that we're saying to parents, some of the days of the week, your child is not going to be on the property. We recognize that our students and or their parents, for the purpose of this conversation, I'll say they're students. What models are we following, or what models can we follow to address the social, emotional needs of the students that we serve in a virtual setting? For example, in my system, we have embedded in our remote as well as our e-learning program in Dalton West School District 148. In our plan of action, we have provided for all teachers some examples of the types of activities that should occur on a daily basis to help them to address the social and emotional needs of the students while in the home setting. Are there any other recommendations or models of success that are specifically designed for the purpose of addressing what we know our students need support with, particularly if they're spending any time off of the property during COVID-19?
Can I address some of that? So as a mental health professional and addressing the social emotional needs of students, we provide services synchronous and asynchronous learning. So the child with, of course, with the having the access to the internet, the mental health professional would meet with the child or a group of students remotely. And then on the days that they did not meet remotely, they would have it where the students would receive assignments, social emotional learning assignments, many of them based on the need of that particular group. Any good mental health professional would go into a situation and do what we would consider to be a needs assessment of that child or of that school, and then base their interventions on that need. So I would recommend that in returning to school, the hybrid model, that the mental health professionals, of course, in CPS would be involved with the principals to determine what exactly the needs of the group of students and whatever pod would be. It could be dealing with anxiety, because anxiety has been a pretty high, we have a high instance of anxiety with the students since we've been gone in March. And a lot of teaching them how to calm down with mindfulness techniques. So I would say a very good mental health professional to work in those schools, regardless of the model, to have interventions to help students and teachers and the whole school community.
And I'll just chime in. Thank you, Ms. Franklin. In CPS, we have seriously recognized the needs for social emotional supports for students. And so we have expanded our Office of Social Emotional Learning. I know that they've just went through hiring some additional staff to assist, and we have increased our menu of options for schools and to directly benefit students understanding that there is definitely a concern, as it has been resonated on this time of sharing today, definitely a concern, and we're definitely not ignoring that concern, but really pulling our resources together to positively impact our students, and embedding our social emotional learning supports within the curriculum. Our district just launched our professional learning series for all of our educators in the school and all of our schools, and directly embedded in their curriculum is strategies for social emotional learning, because we understand the great need for that at this time.
Speaking of learning, one of the reasons why school district officials are really anxious, and I mean that in a positive way, to get students back to school is because we're concerned about the potential widening of the academic achievement gap. That is at the forefront of our thinking. I must say, the academic achievement gap that existed between children of color and children experiencing the impact of poverty, which include white children and Asian children and the like, and their more affluent peers, existed long before COVID-19. With that being said, for school districts that are considering remote or hybrid model, I need to identify an issue that I've not yet heard discussed on any national program. And do you want to know what that issue is? That issue is associated with the fact, and I'll tie it back to one, I'm going to make the fundamental assumption that we have all the health information that we need, including the positivity rates at the local level for our families, so that we can make an informed decision and that we actually let students into the building. Two, that all of our students, every last one of them, have access to a piece of computer technology as well as unlimited high-speed internet. That's going to be my second assumption. And then thirdly, where I'm going with this is I always share in my system that the purpose of giving our students access to technology is so that they can access content. The technology is to be used as a means of enhancing instruction, not replacing instruction. With that being said, those of us that are looking to follow a remote or hybrid model, the curriculum textbook company writers are sharing with me the following. They say, Dr. Whitaker, when we wrote the online digital version of our curriculums and of our textbooks, we did not write them for students to be out of school 3 and 5 days a week. I need our audience to hear that, because it's not fair to suggest to teachers, and I'm not suggesting that we're doing that. What I'm doing is raising consciousness, educators and community members, about what is really happening. So if we've not engaged in conversations with textbook companies, what the presidents of the major textbook companies and their support staff are saying to me, that really they have to convene teams together to build curriculum specifically for the purpose of supporting us during this period of COVID-19. And they need time, possibly even a year, to get that done. What I'm not suggesting is that we can't pull it off, right? Educators, leaders, senior level officials, we've done a whole lot more with a whole lot less. But the purpose of this town hall discussion is to raise our consciousness to the highest level possible about what it is we're tasked with doing. So I'd like to see us take it easy on ourselves. We're doing a lot, but do recognize that when we say that we want students to access the teaching and learning process, let's be honest with ourselves and also recognize that the leaders of the textbook companies have got to go back and redesign models, and commend ourselves for the work that we're trying to do, but recognizing that there are some holes in the process. With that being said, with regards to teaching and learning, again, following various models, how possible do you think it is to address the academic achievement gap following models that look like remote or hybrid model learning?
Well, I gave a moment of pause, and since no educators jumped in, I will jump in. And I will point to the Q&A also, which is that the education and achievement gap predated COVID-19. So this notion that we've got to get our students back into the classroom and back into schools, I can understand that because it's more than just achievement. There's many issues that get addressed when there's a trusted adult laying eyes on a child every day, when children are actually getting 2 meals a day in school. You know, being in school provides more than just dealing with achievement, but the achievement gap predated COVID-19. So this notion that we've got to somehow rush kids back or the gap is going to widen, I don't see the evidence that, you know, in many of our school districts that we've got what we need to not prevent that from happening anyway. So my call to action is, where is safety first? Because the reality of it is, if we do something to our children that suppresses their long-term capacity for learning or their long-term life potential, we've actually done more harm. And I think our first obligation as people invested in, whether it be education, the legal aspects of our society, civil service or public health or medicine, and all of the various disciplines, dentistry, everything that's represented here, our first obligation is to do no harm. And so this notion that we've got to rush kids back to school so we don't widen the achievement gap, well, we're missing an opportunity, I think, with COVID-19 to really do a fearless inventory of what are the real weak spots and gaps in our system and figure out how to fill those gaps without doing harm to our kids along the way.
I'd like to just add to Dr. Holden's comments that we will be the first to admit, I'm started out as a classroom teacher. I will be the first to admit that there is no substitution for in-person learning. That time that a child spends in a classroom with a group of students, with the dedicated, committed teacher who has sound pedagogy, sound instructional practices, a love and a care for children, and a desire for them to succeed. There is nothing that takes the place of that. And so with that, I would say that we are doing the best that when I say we at the Chicago Public Schools are doing the best that we can and thinking through all of the possibilities and what school could look. School is going to be reimagined no matter what we do. We reimagine school in March. It's just the way it is. We don't have a vaccine right now, so we don't know what's going to happen from day to day. But we decided we needed to have a plan in place in the event that we were able to open schools. The jury's still out on whether or not we were going to be able to open. But in the event that we are able to open, what's the best decision or what is our best thinking at this time? So of course, in-person learning is paramount. And I agree, Dr. Holden, safety is our number one concern. As a parent of a fourth grader, that's my number one concern. And as a caring individual for children, that is my number one concern. That is Dr. Jackson's number one concern. And she has said, if it is not safe, the science and the guidance tells us it is not safe to open schools, we will not open schools to put children and our staff in harm's way at risk. Our adults matter to us, our children matter to us. And so we're just doing our best, putting our best thinking forth right now and soliciting all of the ideas and the input from our community stakeholders, from our parents, our partners. Please, if you can, attend one of the virtual community meetings that are happening this week. Another one is tomorrow. We want your input and your thoughts and couple that with the guidance and the science so that we can make the best decision for students. And to be quite honest, we might not know until the end of August which way we're going, because we have to remain flexible and open to what the guidance, what the health officials are saying to us, what our parents are saying to us, and what our staff is saying to us. We're talking to all of them. We even convened a group of principals to get their thoughts. So we've been very diligent and intentional about engaging the voices of many, even our students, letting us know how they feel, what it is they need. Do they feel that we should open school? So we're open to all of that. But what I can guarantee you is that any decision that is finally made will be in the best interest of the health and safety and welfare of all of the, and I want to say the constituents of the Chicago Public Schools, staff and students and their families.
And
Dr.
speaking
Whitaker,
of engagement, go ahead.
Dr. Whitaker, you know, Dr. McDougall pointed out early on that the Florida Marlins, with all the resources that they have, still they had players contracted the disease and needed to shut down some games. I think given the numbers of infections and certainly given the numbers of deaths, we can be assured that our children or somebody's going to come up sick. And what's going to happen when that starts to permeate in a school? What's going to happen when it starts to permeate in a class? And then we'll figure out how to close up and do something then. This time, as Dr. Holden pointed out, gives us an opportunity to use this crisis and figure out how we shore up some things that were not shored up before. The educators have always done a great job. You have always done a great job. And what the studies have shown is that while our children are in school, we exceed the gap. It is what we're not able to provide when they are out of school. That's where the greatest gap comes between Black children and brown children and Asian and white children. Right now, under this crisis, nobody can go anywhere. So those who were getting that enforcement and reinforcement in the summers by taking trips or doing whatever the excursions were, cannot do it because everybody was confined to home. But what we do learn, and what you may actually know, Dr. Whitaker, better than the rest of us, is what is happening within communities where there is this digital divide. How are we getting technology to people? How are we dealing with the internet issue? How are we making sure that we can do some level of learning, and whether that's tutoring when we all come back or whatever it is, using technology, how are we using this time to ensure that we are better going forward? Because there should not be a rush to get back to school. There should be a plan that whenever we get back, we're going to be better than we were before.
I want to answer that question and then pose a question. And also, we do actually have a few questions that have been posed to us before we close. But one of the things we haven't talked about is is specific to kind of adding value to what Mr. Williams said, which is relevant to some funding that has been made available for school districts during this time frame. From a national level, right out of DC, school districts officials receive funds specific to the CARES Act. And the CARES Act funds was designed for the purpose at the school level of giving us additional funds related to addressing a number of different topics. In our system, in my district in particular, where Dr. Kevin J. Nolte serves as superintendent of schools, in 21 days, we closed the digital divide. So in 21 days, we are at the approval of our Board of Education for Dalton West School District 148. We are now in the process of providing a laptop computer or Chromebook and broadband access to every, not family, every student enrolled in the entire district. And we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge the fact that a great portion of the funds made available to do that did come as a direct result of the CARES Act. So we do, I'm sure all school district officials want to say a thank you to any and everyone that was involved in making those funds available to us. Also in the great state of Illinois, our Governor Pritzker, also released funds, or is in the process of releasing additional funds for school districts. Now, unlike the CARES Act, for our governor's funds that he's making available for us, we do have to write for those grants. I'll just leave it at that. But the neediest school districts in the state of Illinois get to compete, but we do get access, assuming that we meet all the criteria, to additional funds for which we can address the technological, including broadband needs of the diverse population of students that we serve. I'd like to ask you all, can you please share what you believe, how important do you believe that parent and community engagement is in the decision-making process relevant to school district officials making this important decision about what model to follow? and perhaps take just a minute or so, because I do now need to watch the time, to describe what level of involvement the community members have had in your respective organizations specific to this topic.
Well, I'll just add one thing real quick. I think I'll be forthcoming. I'm a public health person, community engaged, health equity researcher, almost all of my career. I think the voice of community is absolutely essential. I think it's critical that we not do anything to people, impose anything on them. That's more of the same. We've already had that. But I think of it as a choir. And so the voice of community, the voice of parents, the voice of students should be an important voice in that choir of voices that come forward. As a public health professional, I would love it for you all to put it in my hands, because I would lead through that lens. But I too am a parent of 3 now college-age students. My daughter just graduated from high school this year. I know the tremendous stress and trauma she faced going through this period, missing senior prom, missing graduation, all of those things. As a parent, I was asked to chime in. Should we have an in-person graduation ceremony? She picked up her high school diploma, which she earned on her knuckles in a drive-through ceremony. We had to drive through in our car. She was able to get out. We had to take a picture from her on our cell phone with a selfie stick sticking out of the window. She was the only one allowed to get out of the car. I appreciate that versus nothing. I appreciated the opportunity as a parent to chime in, but as a public health professional in my heart, I also appreciated that none of us were put in harm's way for her to have this seminal rite of passage called graduating from high school, walking across the stage and getting your diploma. So I do think the voice of parents and community is important, but I don't think any one voice carries the day here. And I'm speaking as a public health person who would love it if my voice carried the day. Because we go back to the flu pandemic of 1920, where we lost so many lives and we learned so many things. Your mama taught you to wash your hands before dinner. You know, you couldn't run in and out the house. People don't realize all these life lessons and all these practices that we have in place. Many of them came out of the flu pandemic of 1920. We passed down the practices, but we didn't pass down the story. So my question is, what's the story that we're going to tell from the COVID-19 pandemic? And I do understand it's difficult. I'm not pretending, and I feel greatly honored to be in this conversation with such a diverse and really thoughtful group of people. So the voice of parents and the voice of community is critical, but it's not the only voice. We need a choir.
I agree with you, because I feel that you cannot educate a child that you don't understand. And you understand the child by understanding all the systems that are involved with that child. And that is the family, the community, even religion and culture, all of that. That's who the child is. And so to educate that child, you have to know all of the factors in the child's life. So I believe involving the community, the family is paramount in order to make a decision to move forward with any form of education.
I think there's several things that you shared thus far. The community input is wonderful. I think the CPS model of these series of town hall and meetings, asking people to give their input and their thoughts, and so we want to help market that. In our chat, we have a question about the children who are not in a public school as such. They're enrolled in the Department of Corrections. They're in juvenile detention. How are they being educated? What does this mean for them is one of the questions. And there's a YouTube question for our judges. How do we advocate for federal funding, specifically for teletherapy, mental health services for all students? Those are 2 questions that our viewers of this town hall have raised.
And then, Reverend Jeanette, I'd like to gear up Attorney Patillo just so he knows what's coming his way. I have a question, which is, if insurance companies refuse to insure school districts, what would be, they asked a number of things, but for the purpose of time, I'm going to ask a part of this question. What would be, the economic outcome?
Okay, so those are 3 questions. That's for everyone. Y'all jump in. I know Dr. Holden is going to jump in.
All right,
what happens with, I want to know about these children that are in juvenile detention right now. They're being exposed to COVID possibly. They're sheltered in place. They have no ability to social distance. How are they being, are they being educated? How do we deal with that challenge? And their silence.
So
I can chime in as far as North Carolina if you want, or I'll yield the floor.
Well, from a prioritization standpoint for COVID-19 screening, those children should be placed in higher priority. We spoke earlier to surveillance and determining the infectivity. I would think that being in that setting, that the local community and state would place a higher priority on the screening. Now, also in regards to the PPE, that is a community-made vulnerable, and I would think that local officials would pay special attention to not only the precautions that are taken in that confined space, but also the teaching environment and the access to broadband and the like that we've spoken here to this evening.
So if I could chime in about the educational aspect of those children who are in the Department of Correctional Services, if they have the right to be determined whether or not they're children with special needs. The same child find obligation exists in those communities as they do in the public school systems. Those are considered public schools, just as a local educational or state educational agency is. So there's a child find obligation for those children too if they have special needs, and they have to provide them with the special education, the assistive technology, the related services. That is, if they refer them to have an evaluation and be determined. Many of those children, unfortunately, don't have parents or advocates for them who can enforce the child find obligation of the Department of Corrections, who's considered a local educational agency under federal law. That's the problem. Once they leave the correctional agency, if they go into the adult prison system, there's no obligation. So they are, in fact, many times the lost children in this situation.
And on the issue of insurance, if I understood the question correctly, what would happen if a school district was not able to be insured, or if the premiums were too high? They will more than likely require individual indemnification of a person's child. So they would more than likely require an additional insurance policy on each child provided by the parent if the school district is not able to do so. As I said, none of these things have worked their way through legislators yet. None of these things have worked their way through the court system yet. So a lot of this is just up in the air as to exactly what would happen.
If there are no further questions, I'd like to bring us, I'd like all of the audience members to prepare to comment and give a closing remark relevant to the question that I want to pose. And the question that I want to pose, if I might be, I'll say vulnerable and authentic, is a couple of weeks ago, I won't say what city, but I saw a parent on the street and she had tears in her eyes. She was frustrated. She was marching. And I looked at that woman's eyes, and she looked at the camera, and I had no idea what she was going to say. And she looked in that camera with tears in her eyes, and she said, "I just want leaders to lead." And I was like, I don't know, maybe some of you know that parent. She wants leaders to lead. And so what I'd like to do with all of our esteemed experts and our expert parents on the phone is to have each of you answer one question. What is the one recommendation that you have for leaders? It can be school district leaders, political officials in towns serving our most vulnerable students. If you could give one recommendation for what they could or should do to better support our parents, community members, and or the students that are to report to our schools in some way, shape, or form during this time, what would it be?
As
Listen,
a parent, what I would love is for all the politicians and all the leaders to get in the room together, figure out what we're going to do. Stop trying to tell us how this fund is going to fix this problem, or who's going to get this money, or how this money is going to fix this, or this problem is going to be fixed by that person or that group or that organization or that department of the government. I wish they would please just get in a room, figure it out, and then let us know how they want to lead the people, the constituencies, the residents of their communities, instead of us getting 15 or 20 different leaders saying 15 or 20 different things. We understand that there's political ramifications. We understand that there are legal ramifications. We understand that there are medical ramifications. But most of us do not want to sit through and watch all of our politicians say different things, talk about each other, talk about their plans, talk about their failings. We want the grown-ups to lead us.
I'd like to.
If I could, I will I will go with Dr. Simmons, because since he said that, that's not the one thing I have to say. So building on that, get all those folks in the room and make a decision, honor the trust that we've put in you all, and be willing, if things don't work as well as we hope they would, be willing to de-implement, pull back, do the fearless work of honoring the trust that we put in you and say, we did our best. That is what Reverend Jackson tells us. Always do your best. So leaders, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Dr. Simmons. Come together, do your best, set all the pettiness aside, and be willing to say it's working, we can keep going, or it's not working, and then come back to the table and do the work. I personally know what a hard job it is. I wear many hats. I'm wearing my public health hat in this conversation. I'm so eternally grateful I'm not an educator right now, because Lord, they've got a lot on their shoulders. But do your best and be willing to honor that trust that we've put in you. And if things aren't working, get back to the table, and we have to be nimble and keep adapting and adjusting to do what's best for our children and our communities.
And at that table, I agree. At that table, I agree. First, we need the best, most up-to-date information from the health professionals who truly have the interests of people at heart, who truly want to stop COVID. Combine that with parents who are the community. And please note that all of us here, we may be parents, and we're also the professionals. We're also people who are knowledgeable in this area, and listen to the concerns of the families and what the ramifications could be, and come up with the best possible plan. But let's be ready to change the plan if it doesn't work. Thank you.
And I would like to add, my statement would be from Dr. Holden's talking about the choir. Lead with the resounding sound from the choir, lead with flexibility, courage, lead with the science, and ultimately lead with the heart.
Dr. Whitaker, because we didn't get any direction from the federal government when these things first happened, when Governor Pritzker said the schools were going to close, the schools closed, and there was no discussion about that beyond that. I think when you are in charge, you should take charge. You get all the information that you can, and you make the decision. You follow the science, not the politics. And you follow the dictum of John Lewis. He said, when you see something, say something and do something. Leaders must lead.
Okay. Thank you.
So with respect to the special education population, I would say to the leaders, this is the most discriminated class of individuals of all. although your Black and brown minority students, your Indian students are also discriminated against. Students with disabilities face great discrimination. Don't forget this population and your federal mandate to provide them with free and appropriate public education. Do not forget them. That would be my comment.
We also have to bear in mind special education students are also from Black families and brown families. And so there is that to be considered. It's just a double burden for the families.
What I would say too is we're all leaders, and we chose these leaders. We either chose them by voting or we chose them by not voting. So that's what makes this upcoming election so very important. So be a leader and vote, and then hold people accountable for various positions that they take in support of our various communities.
And my final comment will just simply be informed to the best of your ability. There's a lot of noise and a lot of chatter. Don't get your information on what's going on from just social media and just from your 6 o'clock news every night. You have to really dig down deep so that you know when someone's coming to you for a proposition that is going to be in your best interest. I would say get informed the best way that you can.
And my final comment on this, then I'll turn it over to Ms. Franklin and have Ms. Williams do the final remark, is associated with 2 words, and you're probably not going to be surprised by what those 2 words are. Positivity rates. I am so disappointed and deeply disturbed and deeply saddened at my core with all of the access that local municipalities have to technology and to researchers and the like, and to think that in areas where school districts officials are serving 100% free and reduced lunch and 95% African American or children of color, and we cannot gain access to positivity rates for the purpose of determining if our communities are at a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, or a level 4. Overall, for example, in the state of Illinois, we're at a level 4. But school district officials, are there pockets of communities that are in your respective school district that are at a level 1? If we are to elevate our decision-making, we must demand that information be made available to us as soon as yesterday. And I expect, and I mean this with the greatest level of respect and the highest level of sincerity, because I believe that our elected officials can and will make this happen. But I expect, with all the hope that I have in me, that in the next 24 to 48 hours, one of us is going to look on the news and somebody's going to say that as a direct result of this conversation, that information is being gathered. Thank you. Reverend Jeanette?
I want to say that I think in leading, I think you have to lead with data, with dignity and respect. And lead because our children's lives depend on it. We are all in an awesome position where what we're doing for children affects generations. And so we have to lead with data, with dignity and respect, because our children's lives depend on it.
Well, I just want to thank each one of you, particularly Dr. Whitaker, for leading and engaging us in this powerful discussion. She's going to get the final word. But I want us to not make this the last time we join together to have this conversation. We need to have this again, probably the latter part of August, as we look at decisions being made for schools to reopen. This is going to be an ongoing dialogue as we look at the legal challenges, not just for special students with special needs, but for all of our children, there are some legal issues that we need to be able to raise that question whether or not we are guaranteeing every child access to a high quality public education. And of course we're not. We need to be demanding that at every level, particularly in this era of COVID. We also know that everything has changed since COVID. And whether we like it or not, we're moving into a more technological format for delivering education. And so we need to be wrestling with what will that look like going forward towards the end of this year, 2021. How will we provide education for every student in a different way? Parents have concerns, those that still have jobs that cannot work remotely. So when we just say, well, we're gonna have remote education, what are you gonna do with the children when parents are not there in the home? And so we have to look at the other stakeholders like Rufus Williams and Better Boys. What does that mean for churches, community organizations to fill in the gaps, even though we have to social distance and we have to have the appropriate PPE? What does that mean for all of us? Because it's not just schools a problem. It's all of our problem and all of our challenges to educate these children. And what you didn't discuss is the fact that we never spent any time training the educators on use of technology. And it's not automatic that they know how to use the technology. I'm a science major. I used to visit schools and you see computers on desks. The teachers didn't know how to use to teach with. So not only did the providers not provide the appropriate digital curriculum, nobody has trained the educators to operate in the 21st century. Whether you're in K-12 or higher ed, many of the teachers are the most vulnerable because they learned without digital tools. And now at 65 and 70, they're being bombarded with this whole digital platform that they're not familiar with. They got spotty Wi-Fi at home. And so when you go remote, you remotely have spotty Wi-Fi educators trying to teach children with no Wi-Fi, and parents trying to go to work because I'm not able to work remotely. I got to be at Walmart with a mask on and all of that. So it's just, there are a lot of things that we need to be talking about, and we need you to be like Dr. McDougall and Dr. Deborah Fair-Holden with the Health Committee. We have to stay together and wrestle with these concerns on a regular basis. We need to be meeting once a week, updating ourselves and the community on where we're going. We need the educators honestly telling us what they're dealing with, the legal team, what they're looking at, parents, and we got to talk to these young people. They are afraid. They are worried about if they go, will they see somebody? They're in social media so much so that they're getting all of their information, not from TV, not from parents, but from TikTok and Instagram. And so we got to figure out, how do we communicate? See, I know these things. I talk to young people. So these are, we have to really, we got to focus, and we need your help. Reverend Jackson would tell you tonight, he would say, we're going to meet next week. And we are. We're meeting, or he would tell us to meet tomorrow. Dr. McDougall and Dr. Deborah Fair-Holden know this. We have another town hall next week looking at higher ed and what happens to athletes. How do you send your son back to play football? They cannot social distance in a huddle. Or if they're a linebacker, I argue with a young man. So when you're on the line, you're breathing the same breath of everybody on the line in front of you and the line beside you. So we're going to talk about, what does it mean to send your child to college or and to these schools, these institutions where they're in the minority on these campuses? How does that work with all of the Black Lives Matter and all of the marches? What happens when your child goes to the school and now they are a minority and harassed? So we're going to do that on August 3rd. It's higher ed and NCAA. August 10th, we're looking at children in Black children and brown children in these majority institutions. They're going back with COVID and they're going back with racism. And so we're going to look at racism in education and how our students have to deal with those issues. And then Dr. Whitaker, we have to reconvene this body to just dialogue. Where do we go from here? I don't have the answers, but I know that together we can come up with the appropriate approaches. Maybe it's having every child tested as they enter schools, not just giving do a thermometer screen. We have to begin to build a database. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Please share in your social media. This will be on YouTube. It'll be in some of our social media outlets. It's on Facebook now. So if you create a watch party, Lana Ford and help push it out, our social media director. We had 150 viewers on Zoom. We need them to, share and like and whatever y'all do to communicate it around. I don't know all of this stuff, but I know y'all can push it out. And I'll ask Rose to make sure that she sends a note to everybody that's watching us on Zoom. This will be on our Saturday morning forum the week of August the 8th. That Saturday, highlights of this will be on the broadcast. So y'all smile for the broadcast. Dr. Whitaker, take us out.
Yes, so we would like to say thank you so very much for our super esteemed panelists, as well as our super esteemed family members, the Simmons family. Thank you for giving of your time. And as I started out, like any good teacher, without saying it directly, I stated our overall objective. And our overall objective was to not only identify potential issues associated with the types of very tough decision-making that has to be had relevant to official determining what model to follow for students to return to school. But I also indicated that we intended to provide potential recommendations and solutions that could aid you in the process of doing so. I think we've accomplished that goal. We don't plan to stop here. As Reverend Jeanette Wilson has said, we plan to move forward. In the meanwhile, good night. And leaders, let's lead. Thank you.